Good afternoon. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. And I'd like to thank you for joining us for another installment of our Understanding Our New World series. And today we're going to shift to the world of politics. We've been talking about it a little bit kind of around the edges, but we really want to do a deep dive into our current political environment. And couldn't find a better person than today's guest, Hulse, who's the chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times. Carl's been with the Times since 1986, has covered Congress. He's been a Washington editor. Carl's also written a wonderful book, which we're going to talk about, on the Supreme Court, that is going to be coming out in paperback in a couple of weeks. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that. And I should say Carl has also some strong Illinois roots. He's from Ottawa, Illinois, went to ISU, knows Illinois well, he visited us at the Institute about 2 years ago, and was wonderful speaking with students, gave a wonderful public lecture. One of his lines I remember was, he said that he's pretty certain that he was the only one from the New York Times Washington Bureau who'd ever driven a combine. So I'm assuming that probably is still the case. So Carl, welcome to our conversation. It's great to see you again.
Yes, I am a true Illinoisan, but from the other end of the state, really. It's quite a ways away, but thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Carl. Well, let's just talk maybe initially about these last couple months on Capitol Hill. I know you spent a lot of time covering Congress, and as you and I back in the day, there'd be, Congress would fight for weeks on end for a $3 billion offset or a $2 billion tweak here and there, protracted fights. But in the course of 5 or 6 weeks, they passed almost $3 trillion in economic rescue legislation. So just go to town. Tell us about just the atmosphere, the environment, and also what they assembled.
Sure, the deficit hawks, I said in one of my pieces, have had their wings clipped. Nobody was really talking too much about the expense of it. I mean, it's a unique situation. We are in something that no one has experienced before, a pandemic. Really, we've had some smaller ones, but this was the most comparable, I think, to the flu pandemic of 1918. So folks hadn't lived through this. There was a real drive to get some legislation done. But if you remember, it started kind of slowly. There was, a supplemental appropriations request, and people kind of looked at that and thought about that for a while. But I think a couple of things happened that made this first, what we call CARES Act, or Phase 3, which people talk about. So Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, the first couple of pieces of legislation, he'd sort of let Nancy Pelosi and the Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin handle, and the Senate stepped back. He wasn't really sure what the Senate Republicans wanted to do. And it got to a point where the Senate Republicans said, hey, we want to be a part of this process, drawing this bill up. And all of a sudden it was happening in Senator McConnell's office. So over, 10 days there or so, they threw together this bill. Probably the most notable thing about it is the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. I think that's what people most hear about and relate, these loans for the small businesses that can be forgiven. So they went and rushed ahead there and got it done, but it wasn't without some politics. If you remember back then, and I wrote a bit about this, was that the Democrats, and it was kind of a risky strategy, it was actually on a Sunday when the Republicans were going to try and pass this bill finally, and Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats said, hey, we're not going to go along with this. We want more, and we want more in a lot of different areas. And at the time, we all thought that was pretty risky because they were holding up this bill, and that you usually get pounded for that. But they did get some concessions. The White House was willing to wheel and deal. Secretary Mnuchin, who's been a big part of all this, the Democrats like working with him, and the Republicans are worried he's actually a Democrat, so that he gives away the store a little bit. He was also the person who agreed to, and we can talk more about this, the famous extra $600 a week in unemployment benefits that people are, I think, pretty much getting now. There was a lot of trouble getting that going in the first place, but so they got that in, and the Democrats held up. But I honestly, John, I just think that these members, they looked at what was going on, they realized they needed to do something big, but as always, there's a huge political undertone. There's an election in a few months now. They didn't want to be seen as back then as sitting on their hands and doing nothing. They knew they had to go big. So they did. And there's been a little bit of tweaking since then, some more money, but we're now waiting on the next phase. I'm sure you'll want to talk about that. There will be another phase. It's just weeks away right now.
Right. Carl, as they put together these rescue packages, is there, is this Capitol Hill legislating at its worst in terms of kind of the sausage and things kind of thrown on the wall and sticking and not sticking? Or is there a kind of a broader strategic plan about saying, okay, these are the sectors of the economy that we have to stabilize, and once we have this, or, describe
I think
the
it was
process.
a scramble. It was a scramble. But, there hadn't been a lot of legislating going on Capitol Hill. So in some ways, this was the first chance that some members, chairman, let's say, really got to try and do something. And they had programs in the wings that they wanted to try out. So it was, but it wasn't, it's not conventional legislate. It's not going to a committee and working out a bill. It's a bunch of senior members sitting around in leadership offices, negotiating, saying, hey, let's do this, let's do that. It's not the what was the old TV show about, how a bill becomes law? It definitely Schoolhouse Rock.
Right.
It was definitely not the I'm just a bill here on Capitol Hill. It's a different way of doing things, but I will say that a lot of members feel left out, that if they don't get their priorities in or they don't get a voice. And it was interesting. I think this actually surprised Senator McConnell. So when they passed that big bill, and he went in to do his celebratory press conference, and the first questions he was asked is, well, no one got to read this bill. Was this a way to do legislation? And I think he was a little taken aback, because he thought, well, we've actually pulled this off. But some folks were saying, well, no one's even read this thing. But I think, you got to give them leeway in an emergency. This was both sides. And because it's legislation as opposed to nominations and some of the other things that are going on, it has to be bipartisan in the Senate. And that's how the Democrats got their leverage to get more in. And that's the leverage they think they have going forward. So is it the way it's supposed to be done? No. Is it what had to be done at the moment? Yes. I think Paul Simon would have been okay with it, actually.
Well, the other thing that's kind of interesting too is you had the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, who has been saying, do more, do more. And typically the Fed chairman has been a force of restraint and fiscal stability and so forth. But he has been urging Congress to be even more aggressive. So that, I guess it's probably.
Yeah, I think the deficit thing is very interesting here, because everyone's sort of said, we don't care what it costs right now. Although now that's starting to kick in, but it creates problems, because Democrats say, oh, the Republicans only care about the deficit, when it's going to, is a way to put a barrier on some of these social programs. But there's $4 trillion in spending added on top of the debt. I think the projection is now that our national debt is now as big as our economy, which really hasn't happened since World War II. McConnell is worried about that, but you're going to see more spending here.
Well, Carl, I'm glad you went there, because I was thinking about that too, because, I was thinking of the last years of the Obama administration, where I think the total federal budget was something like $4 trillion. So that's, the largest.
But that's with Social Security and everything.
Right, I was gonna say, so you have the largest defense establishment on the planet by volumes. And then you have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, national parks. The whole government costs $4 trillion. And in the last 6 or 8 weeks, they've passed packages that accumulate to about, what, 2.8 trillion?
Yeah, your business reporting background is coming out there. I mean, yeah, discretionary spending in the federal budget is about 1 trillion. So almost 3 times that. Huge amounts of money. Some people think, oh, deficits don't matter anymore. But, somebody has to pay somewhere along the line, I think. So it's a pretty major concern. But you see that the Democratic bill that was already passed, the HEROES Act, now we're gone from CARES to HEROES. Everybody's learned how to name their bills here pretty well. They can thank Newt Gingrich for that. He was always sort of the king of that when he came in. But, are they going to pass another 3 trillion? No, but, Nancy Pelosi thinks that's what's needed. So that would be, 7 trillion in debt in deficit spending in less than 6 months. I also wonder now that, I don't know, this is far from my area of expertise, but, no one's paid their taxes yet, really. And I read a story that a lot of tax returns are still sitting around. So we really don't have any clue about the financial situation of the government right now. And I would hazard a guess that tax revenues are going to be way off what anyone projected they were going to be at the beginning. So this deficit situation is actually worse than it even looks right now.
Yeah. Well, I was interested. Let's talk a little bit about the next phase, as you put it, because the House Democrats passed, I guess, about a $3 trillion package. Mitch McConnell said, let's put a pause. Speaker Pelosi said, this virus isn't pausing. We can't pause.
Right.
Is it in the next 2, 3, 4 weeks that they will come together and find something between 3 trillion and, where
Zero.
McConnell starts out?
3 trillion and zero. So a lot to say about that, actually. Senator McConnell, immediately upon passage of that last bill, said, we're stopping. I want everyone here if we're going to consider these bills. The Senate has been coming in and meeting pretty much regularly, and they are again this week. They were off last week. But I think Senator McConnell got in a situation where he realized he didn't want to have just these small group negotiations anymore, because he was losing in them, because the administration was going in and pretty much dealing with the Democrats now. So he said, first, we're going to stop. And then he became even more resistant to the idea of another package, saying, well, if there is another one, as opposed to when there is another one. I actually wrote a piece about that and said, that's going to be a pretty hard position to sustain with 40 million people out of work, that you're not going to do any more aid. Now, he also said, of course, that the states should consider going bankrupt. That blew up in his face as well. We're definitely going to have another bill, and it's just a matter of what the size of it is. And I think, it's a big concern. These folks are all running for re-election right now in the House, all of them, and a third of them in the Senate. And the Senate, Republican control of the Senate's at risk. So you can't sit back and say we're not going to do anything. Some of these states and cities are going to go bust, and they're not going to be able to pay their police and firemen because they live under a different set of rules, right? The federal government can spend into deficit all at once. A lot of cities and states are obligated to balance their budgets. Going to mean some cuts. So I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on the federal government to come up with some more money. So there'll be something. It'll probably be right before the how the Congress works, right? It takes some crazy deadline. 4th of July is a nice big fat deadline looming here. I think they will get something, but it's going to be very, very difficult. Nancy Pelosi has already put her marker down. Mitch McConnell's marker has been liability protection. He wants to make sure that businesses and governments can't be sued. So they're going to have to reconcile that. A lot of folks have a lot of different ideas. The president and the White House, they want a payroll tax cut. I hear talk about a capital gains tax holiday, those sorts of things. You also have this weird situation where the president and the Speaker of the House can't speak to each other anymore. So I don't know how at some point they have to come together on a deal. And then in the midst of this, now we have this tremendous civil unrest over police brutality A year ago, if you would have said we were going to be in any kind of situation like this, or even 6 months ago, people would have gone, that's impossible. But we are facing a health crisis, a civil rights crisis, economic crisis all at once. And it's a difficult situation, but I do think that there will be another big piece of legislation.
Right. Carl, let's shift a bit to the political realm, because as you pointed out, with all of these amazing developments, it's a political year with, a presidential election just 5-6 months away. Give us your sense of how the campaign looks from the perspective of the Trump White House. What landscape do they see? Obviously a much different one than they did 90 days ago or 120 days ago, but what do they see as they look at the political landscape?
I mean, they were going to run on a booming economy and a booming stock market. And although the stock market is held up probably better than most people expected, the economy is in a tatter. So how do they do this? I think we're going to see in the next few days, how does the White House political message around the civil disturbances that are going on right now. I think that the Republicans are really nervous. It's hard to imagine you could have that level of unemployment and have a president reelected. I think that all conventional wisdom and tradition shows that people vote their pocketbooks when it comes to the presidency. So I'm not saying that his definitely going to be defeated, but I'm saying they have to readjust their strategy, figure out how to do it. I mean, I don't know how many election cycles I've covered since I've been in Washington, but it's a lot. And I've never seen anything like this. In some ways, there is no campaign. Joe Biden is now just venturing out of his own home and doing some events. It's funny to talk to longtime presidential reporters that they miss the campaign trail so much. These are people who live to go out on these campaigns. And so you have this situation where there's a big campaign, but no campaign happening. Congressional can't now, the Senate, the people who run for the Senate who are incumbents, they're in Washington doing things, and they are at least being able to show their voters. But the challengers are out doing Zoom events just like this, or Google Hangouts. But it's also, I think the fight for the Senate majority is really the interesting fight to me, because Republicans started out in pretty good shape. It would have been, it's hard, but they're in real trouble now too. And in some ways, the message that they had planned to run on, certainly when it looked like Bernie Sanders might be the nominee. Remember that?
Early March, yeah.
And they were all prepared to run against Democrats as being socialists who waste all the government money. Well, guess what? Republicans have been voting for some pretty big government programs here. I think that anti-socialist message is a little bit out the window. It's just the most bizarre, uncertain political campaign time I've ever been in. And now you have the fight over mail-in voting. And that's sort of shorthand. There's a lot of other elements of that Democrats want. And one of the things they do want is more extended in-person voting. In a lot of states, there's limits on how many weeks before you can open up polling places. They want more of that. So there's a lot going on here, John, and we're just going to have to see how it plays out. But I expect that the Trump campaign, the president's very eager to get back to his rallies. He wants a full-on old-style convention in Charlotte at the end of August, and he's having to negotiate that with the Democratic governor of North Carolina and mayor of Charlotte. So we don't know what this campaign is going to look like, but it'll be one we've never seen before.
How do you think the world looks from the Biden basement, as it were? There's sort of two schools of thought. One is, oh my God, he's out of the headlines. How does he get into the race? Every week on the NewsHour, your colleague David Brooks says, stay in the basement and just, the longer you don't make a mistake, the better off you are. You don't have to reintroduce yourself. The country knows who you are. It's not like you're Mayor Pete and you have to introduce yourself. So on some level, people seem to believe that these last couple of months maybe have played to Biden's advantage in terms of helping him secure the Democratic nomination without a huge fight with Sanders, and now being relatively well positioned for the general election. What's your take?
Yeah, I think they are looking at this, and they're looking at polls. I know there was a new Washington Post poll out that had him doing pretty well, although there's a little lack of energy among his supporters compared to Trump. I think that smart Democrats I know think that the vice president not being able to get out the past few weeks has been pretty helpful to him. And you saw that he made, a mistake in that radio interview when he said something to the effect of, if you're for Trump, you're not black. And that was, that reminded everyone of the potential for Joe Biden to make a gaffe. I'm not even sure gaffes exist, though, in this world anymore with President Trump, right? I mean, some of the things that Biden got in trouble for in the past seem pretty tame compared to things that get said every day. I think they're starting to find their way a little bit more on this. And, the big question now is President Trump's obviously going to try and play a very strong law and order card here as these, and you can just see it. He had a phone call with the governors today, and the reports out of that was that he was telling them they were all weak and they needed to get tough on these demonstrators. So he's obviously going in that direction. Conventional wisdom would say in the past that would be the way to go. I'm not sure conventional wisdom is worth anything anymore. I've seen too much of it, including my own, turn out to be incorrect. So I think the Biden folks feel that they are getting their feet under them and that the party is really ready and eager to rally behind someone other than Trump. But they are going to have to do something, I think, to convince African-American voters, which are the key to the Democratic coalition. Barack Obama showed that convincingly. They have to do something to convince African-American voters that they're serious, they're going to do something different. This has been lingering in our politics and culture for a long time. I think African-American certainly aren't going to swing behind Trump, but they want something convincing from not just Vice President Biden, but Democratic leadership that something's going to change. So I think that's going to be a challenge. I think it influences Vice President Biden's his own vice presidential selection. I think that he's engaged in a search there right now, and he's made it pretty clear that it's going to be a woman. He's guaranteed that, and now the question is it going to be an African-American woman or some woman of color?
Carl, do you think in terms of, I'm not going to ask you to predict the pick because
no predictions.
No predictions. But the Biden camp, do you think that now that they see the vice presidential choice as sort of swing for the fences or play it safe? I mean, how do they even calculate what this choice is going to mean to their campaign?
I think that a lot of those folks and the vice president himself are sort of naturally cautious on these kind of things, but they don't want to overthink it. I mean, in some ways, picking a woman vice presidential candidate is going to be a swing for the fences. He's just already made that clear already. I think that this is a real important choice for him, probably more so than say it was for President Trump the last time. This is something that's going to define him in this minute with a lot of voters. So we're not going to see it for a while, but I think that they're going to try and make a pretty bold choice.
Right. Carl, you made a reference to the battle for the Senate. Republicans, I think, have 53-47 advantage. The map had looked good to them as the year started, but now there's a number of Republicans in, incumbents or in Republican states that now look imperiled. Give us a kind of a quick snapshot of the House and Senate. Does the House feel like it's pretty solid still in Democratic?
Yeah, I think that even though there was a special election in California recently that went Republican, I think House Democrats are feeling pretty good. They've got a lot of money. They like where they are. It's totally uphill for House Republicans. I think that it's very likely that the House stays Democratic. The Senate is different. Republicans figured they might lose a seat or two, but they have one in Alabama that they feel they're almost certain to pick up, right? So immediately any loss is offset. But now you have some folks who are in real trouble. Cory Gardner, Colorado, he's been down in his polls. Martha McSally, who actually lost the Senate race last time and then got appointed, she's been down in the polls. Tom Tillis in North Carolina has a problematic race. You have this situation in Georgia now. There's two on the ballot. Senator Loeffler, who got in trouble for some stock sales. There's no investigation going on, but it's given her, both Republican and Democratic opponents, an opportunity. And then today you have in Kansas, the Republicans were really hoping that Mike Pompeo would run in Kansas and kind of get them out of a inter-party mess that they're in there. But the deadline is now passed, so Secretary Pompeo's not running. So plenty of opportunities for Democrats to pick up. And, this is one of those things where it'll probably go, if Trump manages to win, they can probably hold off the Democrats, because that'll show some, they'll have decent showing in enough states. But if the Democrats can win the White House, there's a really good chance that there will be a Democratic Senate. Combine that with the Democratic House, and then you got the consolidated government. Then the question becomes, John, things that I get excited about covering. Do you get rid of the filibuster? What do you do to move legislation? But I think the Republicans know their chances are really tied to President Trump and his handling of all these situations. And at the end of the day, if the voters decide they don't have confidence in him, they will probably show that they don't have confidence in Republicans to control the Senate.
And to just kind of tighten up this piece on the Senate, I mean, for Biden, if he thinks he has a chance to win the presidency, he's also watched enough of the Senate and watched Mitch McConnell enough to know that McConnell would not be reluctant to block everything that he wanted to do. So Biden must believe that winning control of the Senate, even narrowly, is pivotal to him having a successful presidency.
Yeah. No, I mean, Joe Biden, what he did 50 years in the Senate or something, he certainly understands the dynamics there. Yeah, he got in trouble early on in the campaign for, suggesting, oh, I know Mitch McConnell, I know how to work with him. But folks also remember what happened when Obama came in during crisis, and the Republicans led by Mitch McConnell were not hesitant to block Obama on his stimulus, which was less than $1 trillion, I think you'll remember. So, they were really worried about that number back then. I think the question for Biden, who also a Senate institutionalist, is how far would he go in pushing change if the Republicans were the minority, but did what they tried to do to him, what they did to him and President Obama back in 2009, beginning then. So how aggressive would he want to get? I think he's going to face a lot of pressure from the left to say, you just can't sit there and try and negotiate with Senator McConnell again, because you're going to lose.
Well, Carl, this is a wonderful segue to your book, because confirmation bias, I mean, one of the central figures, of course, is Mitch McConnell. But let's talk about the book and how it came about. And, you're a great daily reporter and analyst. How did the idea of a book come into play? And tell us a bit about the different demands between covering Congress and Washington on a day-to-day basis, and then putting together a book that chronicles a bigger picture.
Yeah, well, I mean, the book is interesting. It was after the election, folks, some literary agents came to me and said, "Hey, you know, this would probably be a good time for you to write a book. What are your ideas? Do you have anything?" And I said, I think the judicial confirmation process is underrated as a political issue, and it was also underrated in how it helped elect Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump got a big benefit out of the fact that the Mitch McConnell-led Senate Republicans blocked uh, Barack Obama from putting his person on the Supreme Court after Justice Scalia died in February 2016. I said that very clearly helped elect President Trump because it gave conservatives a reason to rally around him, you know, even after they accessed Hollywood tape and Trump was suspect in many of their minds. But they thought, well, he's got a Supreme Court opening. We're going to get a new Supreme Court justice right off the bat. That really helped Trump. And I think if you see how President Trump, in our story, I think ran Sunday or today, I'm sorry, New York Times, I'm mixing things up. But when they talked to him about what's he going to do here in this environment, his printed statement was, I'm going to win the election easily, and I'm going to appoint 100 more judges to the federal bench. This is his fallback go-to when he's in trouble. He usually hits two topics, immigration and judges, because he knows that rallies his conservative base. So I started out writing this book about judges and the impact on the courts of President Trump before Anthony Kennedy quit and before the Kavanaugh hearing started. So it actually even turned into a much bigger book than I anticipated. Now, the interesting thing about daily reporting versus this kind of reporting, I learned a lot, actually. I think it actually made me a better reporter and writer. But one reason I felt I could do this book was because I had covered so much of this personally. I'd been there for so much. I'd been for, I didn't really cover it, but I was in Washington for the Bork and Thomas hearings. I covered a lot of the Senate fights after Bush was elected over the appeals court judges. So I had a lot of this. I had a real feel for it. And what I needed to do was go back and talk to a lot of the people who were involved. And because I've been around, I built some relationships. People gave me access and interviews that they probably wouldn't have given other people. And I got some real insight. But I'll tell you, John, the real insight I got was that, boy, will people tell you a lot more later on, you know, after, as opposed to in the moment where nobody wants to tell you anything. I went back and people were telling me things I had no idea had happened, and I was covering it. And I kind of felt, wow, maybe I'm not a very good reporter. I should have known that was going on. And then the writing was interesting because you just have to write it what I tried to write it was as a suspense story. You know, I read a lot of mysteries and escapism to get away from the daily news. And, you know, I've read a lot of books and police thrillers, and I tried to make my book into a page turner. Even though everybody knew what was going to happen, I wrote it as a narrative, you know, so when you hit the end of a chapter, it's like, wow, what happened? And I've had many people who read the book told me later to go, wow, you really pulled that off. So I knew what was going to happen, but I still wanted to read that next chapter to see how it was going to work out. And I think I had enough new information in there that I could get away with it. So, you know, writing a book, it is a chore, but you want to make it intriguing for the reader. And I think that I've had many people tell me that, in fact, I said this, I don't know if I said it when I spoke at SIU, but I've said this to other college groups. I said, you know, I've had several people involved in this tell me they'd much rather read something like this written by a writer like me rather than some dry academic. So, so much for that. It was a real experience.
I mean, one thing that I thought was fascinating in your book is the relationship between President Obama and Mitch McConnell. And as someone who covered Washington, I mean, I knew that it was not a warm relationship, to put it mildly, but I guess I had not even fully appreciated the degree of kind of mutual antipathy. And I think you tell one story where at least in McConnell's view, President Obama would be somewhat inclined to lecture him. And at one
Yeah.
point, he was, in McConnell's view, lecturing him, and McConnell was watching like a baseball game.
No,
And
he was.
just kind of
Yeah, he was watching. He was in his office watching a game. He puts Obama on the speakerphone. This is McConnell's telling, and that a whole inning with the commercials and everything went through before Obama even took a breath and let him get a word in edgewise. And you saw a little of this rear its head recently when McConnell, he was on a Laura Trump show. So I think people tend to, they're speaking to that audience, and they tend to probably go a little farther into their partisan speech than McConnell, who's very disciplined, normally would. And, he talked about how Senator Obama was lack of class in talking negatively about President Trump. And, it just raised the old McConnell. He just didn't think that much of Obama. And Obama, of course, didn't think much of him either. His famous joke at the Correspondent's dinner was when he goes, oh, people say I need to socialize, with Mitch McConnell. Why don't you have a drink with Mitch McConnell? They just had no feel for each other whatsoever.
Do you think Obama could have played the Supreme Court pick? I mean, obviously he could have played it differently, and there was that he could have found a much more kind of wedge candidate that would have made it much, much more difficult for Republicans not even to hold a hearing or to give this person.
There's all sorts of theories, right? How he could have done it differently, and if he was going to lose, why not lose with a candidate that would drive voters more? I don't know. I've gone through this. McConnell and the Republicans had made up their mind. They weren't really going to make a move on this. The one thing in my book that I talk about was, this happened over President's Day weekend 2016, so that's in February, and that there was one recommendation to the White House at that time to immediately, within days, nominate Merrick Garland. That's who you're going to pick. So let's just do it and get the jump on Republicans who weren't back in town yet, and maybe they could go on offense rather than on defense. But Obama wanted to play it straight. He wanted to play it by the book. He wanted to go through his review and interview all the candidates. And that was just an Obama trait, because he was sensitive to the fact that that Republicans didn't trust him. So he's like, but by the time they went and picked Garland, which they were going to pick all along, Republicans were dug in. But it was really something that changed history. I and a lot of other people do not believe Donald Trump would have been elected president without that Supreme Court vacancy. Exit polling shows that there were a lot of people voting for Trump strictly on that basis.
I think in your book you quoted, maybe it was the day that Secretary Clinton won the Democratic nomination, that Trump was then speaking in Iowa and basically talked to a group. He says, to Republicans, he said, you don't want to vote for me, or you may not want to vote for me, but you are going to because of the Supreme Court. Yeah. So get over it. You're going to vote for me because of the Supreme Court. It was just completely understanding all that he needed to do to consolidate the Republican base.
Judges. That's what he said. He goes, you might not like me, that's okay, but you're going to vote for me. Judges. And he's stuck with that. And Mitch McConnell has stuck with that. And, this week they're going to vote in the Senate Judiciary Committee to confirm, and we'll still have to go to the floor, obviously, Justin Walker, who is this 38-year-old that McConnell has known since high school, to put on the D.C. Court of Appeals. And they're voting on judges this week. In the middle of all this, it's still judges.
Well, Carl, the one thing that has struck me too is that, it was 20 years ago the Supreme Court was the decisive factor in a presidential election. And, not to freak everyone out, but one of the kind of nightmare scenarios of our democracy is a very, very close election. And what, you hear a lot of analysts say they could see scenarios where President Trump never concedes the election, that it could become a very, very bitterly a litigated matter. I mean, how do you see, in your book, you talk quite a bit about the Chief Justice and the way that he tries to stay above politics, but never quite manages to do so. Talk about Robertson again and just the challenge he faces.
Yeah, I mean, I always say that in his attempts to be apolitical, he becomes very political. And there was a decision the last couple of days on California on a challenge to their restrictions on churches, where he sided with the 4 Democratic nominated justices. And it was one of those decisions where, it's probably easier for him because in some ways it was becoming moot because the restrictions are being lifted, so he can say, hey, look, it's not always 5-4 us against them. But I think Republicans, there was a reason they were in a big hurry to get Gorsuch and then Kavanaugh on the court. They want a conservative majority on that court for things, about Trump's financial records and whether the administration has to cooperate with Congress. So, yeah, I think people, it's probably not super paranoid to be concerned about what might happen if there's a close election and a challenge. And I think part of my book, John, if you remember, is the impact that Bush v. Gore had on the Democrats. The Democrats thought that Gore should be president. He should be the one nominating judges beginning in 2001. And that was one of the reasons they put the brakes on Bush's judges. They thought that was unfair, that he was now going to go and fill the court with his people. So there's still lingering resentment today over that decision, let alone one to come. But, the court's got a lot of big decisions facing them in the next 6 weeks. So I think there will be a lot of focus on these rulings, and I think it could drive more emphasis on the Supreme Court in the upcoming election. And then if somebody were to decide to quit or some other terrible thing happened to a justice before the election, then I think you would see a huge free-for-all. Not that Democrats could do much to stop Republicans, but it would certainly be a motivating factor.
Do you think Senator McConnell might suspend his view about no president getting a...
Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've made that pretty clear. Somebody said, how long would they do it after the election? Even then, I said, I think maybe up to January 3rd.
Carl, let's turn to a couple questions we've gotten from our audience.
Okay.
Some really wonderful questions. And the first one actually connects really nicely to this. It's from Bill in Chicago, asking just a couple of really thoughtful questions about the Supreme Court. But I guess the overriding question is, do judges even purport to be fair and non-political arbiters, or has it become just assumed that the Supreme Court is a deeply political body, and that when Republicans get a nominee, they will have someone who advances their interest, and likewise, when a Democrat gets a nominee, he or she will choose a nominee that just pushes their agenda?
Yeah, I think purport is a key word there, because I think they all purport to be nonpartisan and say they're going to make decisions, but their ideology is embedded in people, and it's hard to separate that. And I think, but what you're seeing with the Republicans now, David Souter still lingers in the minds of Republicans. Here's a George H.W. Bush nominee, thought to be conservative, from New Hampshire, turned out not to be. I think that has frightened Republicans ever since. And so what you see now in their vetting of judges is that they want to make sure about the conservative credentials of some of these judges they're going to put forward. So they're more carefully vetted to make sure, and they can say they're originalists or whatever, but I think that, at the Supreme Court level, many of the cases, the majority of the cases, don't really involve politics. They're sort of procedural, that sort of thing. But those are the ones we don't hear about and are not that important publicly. The ones you hear about are the ones that are sort of imbued with ideology. And I think that now judges pretty much vote their beliefs there. It's interesting. So talking about Trump, one of the things that helped him was his idea to put out this list of the actual judges he would put on the bench. And that gave people confidence that he was going to pick people who represented their ideology. The conservatives looked at that list and went, great. Now, I was on a conference call the other day with Senator Chuck Schumer, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and Debbie Stabenow of Michigan. And they were asked if Biden should put out a list like Trump did, which helped Trump. And they all said they didn't think that was a good idea. So maybe we won't see that from Biden. But I think most of the time, justices, you can predict the outcome of their vote by the president who appointed them.
Right. We have a question from Simeon from Carbondale. And the question is, will Republicans ever show dissatisfaction with President Trump's behavior? And this is sort of an iteration. I remember you and I, when we were talking, and I asked at one point, I said, so at what point do you think Republicans will break from Trump, if at all? And you said, why would they break from him? I mean, they see him as utterly fundamental to their political survival. And that's just the operating principle in Washington.
This is the most asked question of New York editors to Washington Bureau reporters. And it's the most asked question that I get. And the answer is very clear right now. They are not going to break from President Trump. Their entire political fortune is tied to him. It's not worth it to them to go attract an angry tweet from President Trump. They're in trouble already. They can't make it without Trump's voters. That's their only chance. And then pick up some independents who may be nervous about Biden. They are not going to break from President Trump. The better question to me is afterwards, if the president loses, time goes on, how many are going to say they didn't really ever buy into that Trump stuff? You know. Yeah. But I don't see any real daylight between them right now.
Roe from Glenview, Illinois asks, who's capable of becoming a leader in our badly fractured country? And let's use that as maybe a broader way for you to assess Vice President Biden. I know you covered him for many years when he was in the Senate. You know him well. Give me your kind of rounded impression of Vice President Biden and whether this moment seems right for him in terms of a leader as opposed to the politics.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Biden is a guy who can connect with people. Some folks think he's awkward. He's gotten in trouble, in the past and this current episode. But I mean, for just being a little too friendly with people, and how he approaches women in particular. But Biden truly does feel empathy. I do think that he's had such a, in some ways, tragic personal life. With his own family. I think Biden is one of those guys like President Clinton who could really touch people in difficult moments. And I think it'll be a challenge for President Trump to counter that aspect of Vice President Biden. I mean, obviously, President Trump just doesn't react in the same way. I think the challenge for Vice President Biden is can he lead, if he's elected, in a new world where things have really changed dramatically for him in terms of media, the way people judge you. Of course, a lot of the things that he supported in the past that looked great back then, like the crime bill, don't look as good anymore. So I think he's going to have to fight with that. I think there's a lot of people in the House and Senate who are capable of being future leaders. I think that in both parties there's some sharp folks who are still kind of operating under this leadership in the House and Senate that's been there a long time and haven't really made moves that let other people rise up. And I think that there's a lot of frustration there. So we'll see who kind of tries to break through. But, someone always seems to come forward in a moment like this and the test is, who's that going to be? I'm not sure, but I think there are people who are going to try and have a bigger impact maybe than they've been having.
We have a couple questions on the coming campaign connected to both. Are there going to be conventions and are there going to be debates?
There'll definitely be debates. I mean, that's something that can happen pretty easy. I mean, the only thing to me that would stop the debate is if Donald Trump decided he didn't want to debate.
Well, right. That's one of the one of the options.
I don't think so. I think that because of what's going on, these debates could be the most important debates we've ever had, because this is going to be the one chance for people to compare the two candidates instead of all these public functions that they usually have. Now, Vice President Biden didn't do that well in his own debates with the big crowded field. And I think, he was still sort of getting his feet under him then. But I definitely think debates. Conventions, totally different story. Trump wants to have a big convention. I've been at every convention beginning in 1988, and I'm kind of worried my streak's going to break because I'm not sure that there's going to be a real convention. I think that if the Republicans insist on a full-on convention, North Carolina is probably going to balk. But then can you just pick up and move it to Florida? I mean, these things, John, you've been there, there are huge logistical plans around there. I think the Democrats, I was in Milwaukee earlier in the year. They were very excited about the convention. But I think the Democrats, I think they're already scaling way back, and that it'll probably be non-traditional there. And maybe, there'll be some kind of events, but not normally what you would expect. Debates, yes. Conventions, big question mark.
Some questions about just how the campaign is unfolding now in the House and Senate. I mean, given the sort of lockdown status, at least up until now, are candidates having events, or is it everything through Zoom? How are they raising money? How is the campaign unfolding?
I mean, they're not big events right now. I think there's some smaller fundraisers. Some states are beginning to open up a little bit where you could have, right now it's like 10 people or fewer. I think the next phase in some of these states is 50 people or fewer. So I think then you'll start to see perhaps more in-person events. I think it's going to be a while. It's been all virtual except for people appearing on the floor of the House and Senate, and very small groups. So I think it's, in some ways, to me, that's benefited incumbents because they can just raise money easier, right? So they can go on a Zoom call, challengers. But I think it's going to open up. I think, we're still in the midst. We'll have to see how it plays out there. I think I just lost you.
I think we're back now, Carl.
Okay.
Good. No, but
that's how it's going in the campaigns right there, I think.
That's right.
Your internet connection is unstable.
Final question, Carl. I mean, it seems like, tell us a little bit about being the chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times. Does that perch allow you to just both cover specific stories, big picture analysis? What is kind of the brief of the chief Washington correspondent?
It gives me some leeway, and I get to write a column that's very analytical on Washington. And I think the idea is to sort of bring my experience in Washington over more than 30 years, almost 35 years now, and kind of tie things together, because to me in Washington, all events are related to what happened previously. These things are all connected. And my job is to sort of draw the lines connecting things and saying, here's why this is happening, because this happened in the past. I also play another role that I really like and I think is important, is helping the other reporters, younger reporters, understand that, hey, what you're seeing in front of you right now is interesting, but it's tied to what happened before. And here's how we need to explain this to people. So basically, it's just a nice title for having been around too long.
Well, one thing I thought was especially striking in your book too, in terms of kind of decoding Washington, particularly in terms of process, because the one thing that I observed, and I think you have too, is that the majority party pretty much pushes the rules as far as they can conceivably go, and the minority party is totally outraged until they become the majority party and do the exact same thing. So the notion that either party is just more respectful of the institution or the rules has not always seemed evident to me.
Yeah. Now they always start out, once being in the minority, you go, boy, it's terrible in the minority. We should have treated the minority better when we were in power. And when we get back in power, we're going to treat the minority more like we want to be treated now. That usually goes on for like 6 weeks. And then they go, well, we can't deal with the minority party. We're just going to jam things through. Mitch McConnell, when he took over, we're going to work on Fridays. We're going to put amendments on the floor. The Democrats didn't allow amendments. We're going to let this place work its will. And of course, that goes away. Everybody just falls back into their old habits. Now we have the interesting thing of proxy voting in the House. And that was a big change. Now it's temporary, but it does open the door to the ideas like, maybe we can do things a little differently. I actually am more on the side of Congress should come and meet. And, if you start letting people not even come to Washington, that's probably going to be have a negative impact. Now, this is supposedly temporary for this, but it does make people start to think, well, maybe the old rules don't really have to apply the way they always have.
Right. Well, Carl, final question. We are on Thursday going to have a good friend of yours, Rahm Emanuel, in a conversation. And tell me what kind of role that you think he is playing now in American politics. I mean, he's had every job: chief of staff, congressman, rising star in the Democratic Party, mayor of Chicago. Now, as we were talking offline, he's writing a lot. Tell me about what role you think he is playing.
Yeah, I think Rahm is doing some interesting stuff right now because he's becoming a pundit in a way, but a pundit with a lot of experience and contacts and context, and telling, here's where I think the party should be going. Now he's moderate for a lot of the new Democrats, right? He's certainly not in the AOC camp. Rahm is a pragmatist Democrat. And then also the big city mayor Democrat. But I think the role he's playing right now is it's hard to think of Rahm now moving into the wise men role that folks, but he kind of is playing that. And don't tell him I called him a wise man, because that'll make him too cocky, if that's possible. But that he's providing advice to the party, what he thinks should be done. And I think people are listening to him. I'm sure they're listening to him in the Biden camp. But ask Rahm what jobs he wants if there's a new Democratic administration. I'd be curious what he responds to that.
That may be the last question I ask after the interview is unfolded fully. So, but Carl, thank you so much. This has been great.
That was great.
You are as informative as always and very helpful. And we're going to get you back to Southern Illinois. When you were here last, we gave you an SIU cap to go with all of your ISU caps. So
yeah, I do wear that. I do wear that cap.
Okay, great. Well, when you come back, we'll get you another one. So thank you so much, Carl. Great to see you again.
See you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this wonderful conversation with Carl Hulse. And we will be chatting again on Thursday at 10 a.m. with Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago. So thank you so much.